Welcome to today's local government education webinar, co-hosted by Illinois Extension and the Illinois Office of Broadband. Today, we're kicking off the first in a four-part webinar series for communities to further prepare for broadband infrastructure. And Matt and I are happy to have on the call for you today some of the other professionals working alongside the state's broadband expansion efforts. I'll let Matt give a brief introduction to orient everyone and introduce those individuals. I want to encourage participants today to utilize the chat space to ask questions at any time during the presentation, and those may be addressed in real time or saved for the end where we have a Q&A. Later this afternoon, I'll be sending a follow-up email to those who registered for today's session with the slides and the recording. If you know you did not register for this four-part series, I encourage you to do so, and I'll be putting that registration link in the chat box so that you may sign up to receive the announcements and follow-up materials and recordings for the whole series. Thank you again for being here, and without further remarks from me, I just want to say thank you again to Matt and the Illinois Office of Broadband for coming on today. And Matt, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Nancy and the University of Illinois Extension. It's so great to work with you and collaborate on another webinar. And for those of you who have joined us in the past, I'm going to try to keep my contributions to a minimum today. We'd like to bring in some additional perspectives on the infrastructure and access question of broadband. We're certainly at a historic moment with the level of state and federal funding that's been directed towards broadband, whether it was the Connect Illinois infrastructure investment from Governor Pritzker in the General Assembly back in 2019, or the American Rescue Plan Act, and perhaps the infrastructure bill that's currently pending in Washington. Historic amounts of funding available for broadband infrastructure. So I look at this period in the next 5 years or so as our opportunity to solve this problem with access and make sure that we reach our goals in Illinois of universal connectivity and access around the state. Homes, businesses, community anchor institutions. And so one thing that we're really serious about doing is engaging our local communities and other stakeholders, providers that are interested in participating in partnership with the state of Illinois, talking through these opportunities and how we can be thinking about taking next steps. And so our Office of Broadband, you all know it's a lean operation, but we really take seriously that engagement piece. And so in addition to our ongoing conversations I'm having with many of you over phone or email, we wanted to introduce this webinar series, again, to bring in a perspective from consultants in the broadband industry who can help our local communities and providers think through some of the next steps that might be helpful for taking advantage of a Connect Illinois grant program, using ARPA dollars, anticipating even more federal funding through potential infrastructure legislation. And so the point here in the next 4 Friday sessions here is to understand what a community or a provider could be thinking about right now as they look at these resources ahead of them. And today I just wanted to announce we do anticipate having a new track of engagement in collaboration with University Extension and the Benton Institute and Heartland Forward, launching in January of 2022, specifically focused on community engagement and helping local leaders navigate all these options in front of you and make decisions about how to invest broadband dollars. And so look out for a notice of collaboration opportunity or more word from one or more of our collaborators just mentioned on this opportunity. We anticipate an application window opening in the next week or so and a deadline in December. And so again, engagement with local communities for using public funds for building out broadband access. And so again, we want to take advantage of this historic opportunity. And with that, we want to explore some aspects of this conversation and how local communities and providers can be thinking about taking next steps. And so today, we will be talking a little bit about the case for broadband, decoding broadband language and all the rhetoric and jargon that can be intimidating to a lot of folks who are new to the conversation. And then certainly throughout the course of our time together, taking questions and then opening it up for a discussion and more Q&A at the end. And so we'd like to try to keep this to an hour, but I've already talked longer than we want to. So I think there's some willingness on our part to go a little bit long if we want to. Of course, our next session's moving forward next Friday, the following Friday, talking about approaches and partnerships and then next steps for communities or providers. And then finally, I hope in December, we'll have an opportunity to preview round 3 of our Connect Illinois grant program. And so this is a quick snapshot of what we see coming down the pike in the weeks ahead. In the meantime, never hesitate to reach out to us at broadband@illinois.gov again, our Illinois Office of Broadband. Best way to contact us, broadband@illinois.gov. Of course, look for additional resources on our Connect Illinois webpage. We'll drop that link in the chat here today. And we, again, want to inspire conversations with our local leaders, our governments, our provider community, so that we're able to, again, take advantage of this historic opportunity that we're on the cusp of. And so with that said, I would like to introduce Douglas Meredith, Director of Economics and Policy from one of the consulting firms, JSI, that's been very active in the Connect Illinois grant program over the last couple of years. Douglas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matt. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today, this afternoon. And what I would like to do for the next 20 minutes or so is to essentially make the case for broadband, particularly in a community-based broadband service framework. And to do that, we need to talk about broadband a little bit, get some basics down as we wade into this multi-webinar series, and then address, I intend to address future demand and kind of the market structure, market organization. Then after me, then Eric's going to talk about technology and the language of broadband. So hopefully this will be informative and helpful. If you have questions, just send them to chat and we'll grab those questions. You can advance the next 2 slides, please. So what is broadband? When we talk about broadband, there's lots of definitions out there, and probably the most basic definition is that broadband is a service that allows end users to download and upload digital content to public or private computer servers. So it's kind of this remote. It started back in the 60s with ARPANET. We just, 2 years ago, and we had a 50-year anniversary of the first transmission in the ARPANET framework, and it's actually using communications to transmit and send and receive information. Typically, broadband allows end users to access the quote internet, the capital M, the capital I internet, which is the World Wide Web and all that kind of stuff. And so we've evolved. Years ago we had CompuServe. This is back in the 80s and 90s. CompuServe, and then you had AOL, et cetera, but now the internet is a fairly well-known item. But what I'd like to do is review with you 4 metrics of broadband service, because when we talk about broadband, particularly in grants and in how services are being actually deployed, there are 4 very basic metrics that are used to define the term and give contour and color to the term broadband. The first is speed, the second is latency, the third is capacity, and the 4th metric is price. So let's dive into these just very briefly. First of all, we'll talk about broadband speed. And next slide. The current average US speed reported by Speed Test, which is actually a device-driven speed test. You pick up your computer, your laptop, your phone, your tablet, and you do a speed test. That's from the device. And that is 190 megabits per second download speed and 60 megabits per second upload speed. And so that's what people are getting at their devices, not what's being, at the router. If you have a house or a residential location, you'll have a router, usually a wireless router, that will deliver Wi-Fi to these devices. And so the speed at the router is not the same as the speed at the device. So when you're talking about speed, but have to be very careful as to what are we talking about, because a customer who has a really poor router configuration or has very poor router Wi-Fi signal might be getting very robust broadband speed to the router, but then loses a lot of capacity, a lot of speed in that last little piece between the router and the device. From a policy standpoint, we're still back on speed. From a policy standpoint, the FCC has a 25 megabits down and a 3 megabit definition. So 25.3 is really the FCC's working definition of what broadband is. The USDA just came out with Reconnect 3, and their definition of broadband obligation is 100 megabits down and 100 megabits up. This is what would be called a symmetric service. So it's the same speed up or down. The US experience in speed is not in the top 10 internationally. The speed test global index, the highest speed is 262 megabits per second. Remember, that's at the device. And we have new services worldwide. For example, New Zealand Hyperfiber is a 8 gigabit symmetric service. So it's 8 gigabits down, 8 gigabits up. And so there's lots of different speeds out there. And the concept is, and what I'm going to just try to convince you of in just a little bit is, what speeds you should be looking at for Illinois. The second item is latency, and latency is the signal transfer rate measured in milliseconds in round trip time. It's like a ping test. You're going to ping a device and see how quickly it comes back to you. Human reaction time is about 8 milliseconds. And the ideal concept for voice over internet protocol communication, for VoIP telephony communications, is less than 100 milliseconds. And that's a standard the FCC has used as well. Less than 30 milliseconds is really ideal for common type applications. Self-driving vehicles, though, would require that in a class 5 vehicle that's not out yet, but is on the drawing board. They want to have latency less than 8 milliseconds, and remote surgery, for example, wants to have very low latency, actually better latency or lower latency than actually human reaction. And so latency is a metric that it identifies how quickly the signal comes back and goes forth. It's kind of related to speed, but speed, when we talk about speed, we're talking about, think of it as a highway. If you have a large speed capacity or speed in your service, you could have maybe 6 lanes of cars going simultaneously, rather than each of the 6 cars going one by one. So there's a concept there. Now, capacity, next slide, is the amount of data used over time, typically in a month. And the capacity is measured in megabytes of data. And think of megabytes as storage, in your capacity, not the speed transmission. Speed is in megabits, generally megabits, and capacity is in megabytes. And there are 8 bits to a byte. And that's just how things work in computer language. The current average US capacity, or how much we consume as consumers, is about, depends on who you talk to, but generally it's about 700 megabytes per month of data. That's downloading movies, doing this and that, all the downloads, all the consumption of the information that is downloaded. And there are some services that have caps that exist for fixed services and wireless as well. And we'll talk about wireless in a little bit. But they have caps. And so you would buy a particular service, and the service might say, well, you have a specific speed, commitment up to a certain speed, and you have a certain number of bytes that you can consume over a given period of time in a month. And we see those capacity measures at 1 terabytes. So 1 terabyte or 1,000 gigabytes of data for consumption for the typical consumer. And so we're not hitting the ceiling very much. The upper end of users are hitting that ceiling, and they would have additional charges or whatnot, or they would seek a unlimited capacity plan. And so there are cases where you have unlimited capacity, where you can eat all you can eat. And some providers of broadband will throttle down the speed after you eat a certain much. They're not going to serve you as much as fast, and so they can throttle down that speed. And so there's lots of variations where how the industry is working. The last item is price. This is the last metric, and the OECD has a report that is being widely used in policy arena in Washington that shows that the average US price is about $61 per month. And that is the second or third highest in the OECD world of 35 countries that were surveyed. The average is $38 per month, and China is $31 per month for that type of a package, kind of a typical 25/3. The FCC does an urban rate survey every year, and they survey broadband prices in urban areas. And the urban rate for a 25/3 unlimited plan, so that's all you can eat plan, is $52 a month. And the reasonably comparable ceiling is, has a range, and it can go actually up to $87 to be deemed as reasonably comparable with that $52 urban average. So speed, latency, capacity, and price. So when you're looking at broadband services, those are the standard metrics for determining essentially what the service is we're talking about. So with that as background, let's now turn to the broadband future. What's going to happen in the next 10 years? In 2030 is really the kind of the target date for our discussion purposes today. And if we go to the next slide, there are varying people, varying experts in the industry that say different things. On the upper end, people are saying, or some are saying, a 4-person household will need 2 gigabits per second of symmetric service by 2030. That's a 16 times increase from today's typical service of 131.73. So that's a typical house right now, 4-person household, 130 to 7 up download speed and 70 megabits upload speed is the average. So we have 2 gigabits per second symmetric at the upper end, and at the lower end, you have average household demand will require 300 megabits per second. And in that particular context, we're going to be okay, with the current configuration and the evolution of the industry, because there are a lot of areas that have broadband at that speed, at that 300 megabit speed. There are, and I'll get into this in a bit, there are a lot of areas that don't, and that's where the issue comes from. And the lower end estimate is that most households, 100 to 300 megabits per second is adequate. And they see little evidence to suggest that it will change anytime in the next 10 years. Next slide. This is from Strategy Analytics. And what they have is they have this graph that I want to illustrate for you. And this is the study that says 300 megabits is okay. So they have looked at bandwidth, essentially speeds, this is downstream speeds, and they do see, this is the blue bar, it's increasing, and it's increasing over from today in 2021 all the way up to 2030, it's getting larger. And in that particular case, the case is, well, how large will it be in 2030? What is going to be the broadband demand in 2030? The interesting dark line is the year-over-year change, essentially a percentage change year over year. And what happened in 2019, 2020, and 2021, there was a bump there. That's the COVID bump. And so this particular study is essentially indicating that they don't see any breakthrough technologies that are going to affect or cause another bump over the next 9 years. And so we need to be a little cautious on that particular estimate, because it's very conservative, saying there's not going to be any new breakout technologies for the next 9 years that will cause another bump. Either a demand like a COVID, where you have a lot of home activity and a lot of broadband activity rather than in-person activity, or new technologies or new applications coming online. And our expectations, if we go to the next slide, Matt, our estimate, and we have engineering, our engineering divisions are saying that consumer demand will exceed 1 gigabit per second in 2030. Now, there's going to be a distribution around this speed tier, and so there'll be some lower and some higher. But for 1 gigabit in 2030 is conservative, And it really does account for breakthrough growth services. If you do see a bump, you're not going to be at the 300. So from a community standpoint, looking at 1 gig service by 2030 is within the ballpark. And at a certain level, however, megabits per second, the speed that everybody's fixated on, the service speed is not a factor at a certain level. At a certain level, other factors, the other metrics come into play. And broadband will be instantaneous in that there's no noticeable lag in accessing information for most users. And then at a certain point, we don't talk about the megabits per second framework. Until we get there, though, the speed is a very important metric. I pulled down on the next slide the 2030 consumer expectations. This was a survey, and it's kind of get you to chuckle a little bit as to what the consumers are thinking is going to happen in 2030. There are 10 of them. 59% of surveyed individuals think that they'll be using virtual reality glasses, and they'll be able to interface requests for virtual reality through a neural implant, some type of mind meld implant. 67% believe that expect that they'll be able to realistically mimic anyone's voice through digital enhancement technologies. 45% expect to use a mouth device that will digitally enhance any food that you consume. So you could be eating just a simple gruel, and you could be thinking it's the best 5-star restaurant in the world. 60% expect the experience of smells of visual displays through interconnected digital devices. So you'll be able to you'll be seeing a forest scene, and you'll be able to smell the typical smells in a forest when you're actually seeing it on a screen. 60% of users believe that screens will have icons with shape and texture. So the glass on your screen will have some modulation. Now, you all are probably thinking this is just science fiction, but this is the expectation of consumers that are using internet and how they think that things will happen in the next 10 years, and we can revisit this in 2030 and see how close we all came, but this is kind of an expectation of things. 70% believe or expect that VR games, virtual reality games, will be indistinguishable from physical reality. 50% believe that news reporting will have a verified seal of approval and eliminating fake news distribution. 50% of privacy issues are to be fully resolved and to make the digital world safe. And 60% believe or expect sense-based services to be more environmentally sustainable, and 45% believe a 5-cent shopping experience will exist online. So, and there's all kinds of different facets to this, because and one of the key ones is how are these going to be monetized? If you actually look at that, and we can get into that at another time. But those are the expectations. Let's turn now quickly to the market structure. The U.S. market is heterogeneous. It's U.S. broadband delivery is a mixed bag. Some communities are left behind with broadband availability, and that leads to a particular term that we know in the industry is called the digital divide. And the next slide kind of explains what that digital divide is that it's a major policy concern. It has different facets. It's economic and educational and social. And there's also some progress making in closing the digital divide, or at least attempts to close the digital divide, with mixed results. The US experience is kind of a mixed bag in how that digital divide is occurring. And there are some that observe a digital divide expansion. Instead of closing the digital divide, actually it's growing. And the reason why they say that, I have an illustration on the next slide that kind of gives an idea as to why you would see an expansion. If we have just incremental progress with broadband deployment, the internet have-nots might have a little bit of broadband, and that's indicated by a certain bar. And in the future, they might double their capacity, double their service quality. However you want to measure it, they double it. So the future is double. But the internet haves also have a current consumption experience. And if they double theirs, you know, in their future, it's again doubled. And so the have-nots don't ever catch up because they never get to that vertical bar, that vertical line where everybody should be. That leads us to the following observation, is that closing the digital divide, on the next slide, closing the digital divide requires more investment in the internet have-not areas than in the internet have areas. It's kind of a leapfrogging of for the internet have-not areas is required in order to get everybody up to a particular finish line, you know, or starting line, if you want to describe it. Next slide. The causes of the digital divide are, there's a number of them. Lots of research is available in this area, and it leads to certain observations. And one of them is that communities that do not have a community-based provider lag in broadband service and availability. And there's a policy frustration with this observation, for the existence and persistence of digital divide. And there's an exasperation that it might be expanding. And the reason is this community-based provider concept. And next slide, the community experiences vary. Certain communities are doing just fine, thank you very much. They have multiple service options from several providers using various technologies, and they have quite an array of service options and service choices. Many communities only have two broadband options. Usually it's the cable provider and the incumbent local exchange carrier, the LEC, the telephone provider, or its affiliate ISP. So there may be just two. And where the incumbent LEC is not a community-based provider and community-oriented provider, you may only see one viable option. That's the cable provider that's the option, because the LEC DSL service, the old copper technology that Eric's going to talk about, is not adequate going forward. And so there may even be, and that's where the frustration is. And in other areas, you know, some very rural areas, there's even less than that. You know, the cable provider isn't there, might be using another technology, you know, satellite technology or other technologies to get broadband. Next slide. The federal grants that are available that Matt described is really a hinge point in history. There's so much grant money available for remedying this particular problem. These grants encourage communities to partner with providers in public-private partnerships, as an example, as a structure to remedy the gaps. Some grants require government authorities to participate in the receipt of the grant, and then they, you know, do that. You know, municipalities can deliver that, or they can do a P3 or a public-private partnership. The takeaway for this 20 minutes is that now is to realize there's an opportunity for communities with less than adequate broadband to reach 2030 prepared to have residents participate and businesses participate fully in future opportunities, whatever those opportunities may be. It may be just what you know, the strategic study says, you know, nothing's going to change, or there may be amazing breakthrough technologies that require more than 300 megabits per second. So we have to keep that in mind. So with that, there's an array of technologies that are available to address broadband service. And Eric is going to take over now and give us a brief review of those technologies.
Well, thanks so much, Douglas, and really appreciate that Broadband 101 overview. Handing the mic off to Eric Rajchel from Vantage Point Solutions. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. So yeah, we'll take a look at some of the technologies here, you know, as part of Broadband 101 and decoding the broadband language around those technologies. When discussing them, a lot of times it's discussed in acronym and without actually diving into and understanding those individual acronyms and what the different types of technologies are and what they mean and are capable of providing. It can be rather difficult to navigate. Go ahead, Matt. Thank you. So touching into what is broadband, basic broadband 101. in looking at those, there's a couple of different types of broadband that can be provided, and it's generally discussed as either a fixed wireline or a fixed wireless solution. So there's a couple of different types of wireline technologies that we'll touch on, and then there's also various types of wireless technologies as well. Most common in broadband being the fixed wireless deployment. As was touched on a little bit, there are going to be a lot of different speed references that are made. You have the 10.1, which is at this point becoming a little bit of an older reference. It used to be, in taking a look at these points, you would hear a lot about unserved versus underserved. And, you know, it wasn't all that long ago that the unserved standard was meaning that there was a location that was not able to receive a 10.1 service. And the FCC has increased that here. And an unserved location is now really defined as a location that's not able to receive a 25.3 broadband service, and with underserved being increased from what used to be the 25.3 standard now up to a 100 by 20 service. So the demand for broadband is certainly increasing, even as we're seeing the terms and definitions commonly used when discussing the digital divide and the lack of broadband availability, you know, referring to locations as unserved or underserved. We're seeing those definitions in terms of speed continually increasing. Go ahead to the next slide, Matt. To give an idea on some of these speeds and what they're capable of providing, just taking a look at some of the common speeds. You know, if you're able to get a 10.1 service, you're going to be able to do some basic web browsing, you know, access some email and some standard definition, you know, video and music streaming. In other words, in today's world of high definition and video conferencing and a lot of the technology that we've now found ourselves using, a 10.1 connection really isn't going to give you the bandwidth required for what it is that most end users are going to be trying to do online. With 25.3, you start to be able to get a little bit more in terms of availability and what you're going to be able to do with a speed like that. So in addition to everything that you can do with 10.1, you'll be able to get into some of that, you know, video conferencing, whether it be Skype or Zoom or Microsoft Teams, and then get into some of that HD video streaming. And then from there, kind of what we're hearing a lot now on the 1 gig symmetrical service, you really start to be able to control those smart home devices, the 4K and high definition streaming with multiple users, along with gaming, and it's only going to increase. You know, it wasn't all that long ago 4K TVs was the big talk. Everyone, you know, wanted a 4K TV. You go to the store now and you're looking at TVs, there's 8K TVs on the shelf. And it won't be long before 8K streaming is coming along with that. And it's just going to continue to push up the broadband capacity and bandwidth requirements there. To kind of put it into a little bit of a picture on the speed and what you need to be able to do that here, this chart really kind of gives an idea on, you know, with a lower bandwidth connection, like I said, you'll be able to do some web surfing, email, and then you can see it come and continue to increase all the way down through telemedicine and video conferencing in the supercomputing, where you really get into those increased capacities. And a lot of what's on this chart, we're doing, you know, today and continue to do more and more of, which means the broadband connection and the speeds required of subscribers and end users is going to continue to increase. So with that, we'll kind of take a look at the broadband network and what that consists of and the various components. And then we'll touch a lot on some of the Kind of what's shown in this picture in the green on the access technologies, kind of that last mile providing that service to the end users. But there's really three components to the broadband network. The first one is depicted here in red, and that's going to be your upstream service provider. So, if you're going to be a broadband provider, you have to connect to someone to, get your traffic out to the world, to the internet. Who you connect to get the traffic from your network to wherever it needs to go is really on the upstream service provider. In the blue, we have the transport network. That is going to be kind of your high bandwidth kind of backbone solution that transmits from your last mile access technology to your service provider. So it's really the heart of the network, high bandwidth. You can see some of the data rates we've included here. On the transport side, you have 100 gigabits per second, 10 gigabits per second are common data rates used in the transport solution. And then lastly, we have the access network here in green. And with that, you can see some of the common speeds, like I mentioned, kind of 25.3 with the standard, kind of the FCC definition of broadband, and then larger capacities, 200 megabits per second, all the way up to 1 gig symmetrical and beyond. So taking a look at some of the different technologies that you may hear in the last mile, Matt, you can go to the next slide. We have a couple of different types. A common one that's been heard of for years, kind of on the old copper solution, is DSL, or digital subscriber lines. And then with DSL, the most popular version of DSL that we still see and hear of a little bit is VDSL, which stands for very high speed digital subscriber lines. Now, very high speed in today's realm of speed may be a little misleading. With what we're seeing with VDSL deployments is that a 25.3 service is really about the operational limit of VDSL, and that comes along with design parameters operating on these copper networks. You have some distance limitations and what you're able to achieve with a VDSL solution. Other types we're seeing are a fixed wireless solution. So you have towers, and that last mile solution is provided over a wireless connection. In addition, there are also satellite based internet providers. There's been a lot of talk here, over the last year on low Earth orbiting satellites and the kind of broadband service that those are able to provide. And then lastly, we have a fiber-based last mile broadband connection, fiber to the X. Commonly, there's a couple of different acronyms that you may hear when referring to a fiber solution. You may see FTTP or FTTH, standing for fiber to the premises or fiber to the home. And then within a fiber solution, there are a couple of different flavors of the technology and what can be deployed. There's an active Ethernet solution, and then there's also a passive optical network solution, or a PON. And then with that, most common deployments would either be a GPON or an XGS-PON solution within those network types. So for the purpose of the rest of this presentation, we're going to take a little bit into some of the different fiber solutions and providing that 1 gig symmetrical and beyond service. Fiber is really going to be the architecture that's going to be able to provide those kind of services and allow you to continue to expand and grow your network as broadband capacity continues to increase. So the first one is the passive optical network, which is PON. And in that, there's a couple of different items and a few different ways you can go about a PON network. There's the distributed split with PON, and then you can also look at remote electronics cabinets with that. So the picture on the right there is going to be an example of some splitters that are in some trays where PON is going to be a shared bandwidth solution, which we'll touch on here a little bit more. And then we have the active optical network, which is going to be a dedicated home run solution, meaning that between your access electronics, your primary head end electronics that may be in your central office or main location, and your end user, it's a dedicated fiber connection. So they have an individual fiber that goes the entire way, and it's not a shared resource there. If we go to the next slide, we've got a couple of different diagrams kind of showing the different ways that the networks are configured, and it also touches on that shared versus non-shared bandwidth there. So if we take a look at the passive optical network, like I said, it's a kind of a shared fiber solution, commonly uses a 1x32 splitter in a passive optical network, and it's a shared and limited bandwidth. So as you can see in the picture on the diagram for the passive optical network, we have the OLT or the optical line terminal. Those are your primary electronics, and then you can see the traffic for the 4 users, A, B, C, and D, and then along with a video stream. And as that goes down the line, it then splits to up to, it shows here the 32 end users. And you can see up until we get all the way to the ONT, we have that shared traffic. So all of the traffic on that line goes to the ONT, and then the ONT only selects the traffic in which is being used by that end user. So it's a shared limited bandwidth, all the traffic's on the line. With that, it's a little bit of a lower cost solution. It also has a lower maintenance cost along with it. And then with it being the passive optical network, your common technologies that you would deploy over a solution such as this would either be a gigabit passive optical network, so GPON, or a 10 gig symmetrical PON solution, which would be XGS PON. On the other side of that, we have the active optical network. That's going to be a dedicated fiber. You're going to be able to provide more bandwidth. But with it being a dedicated fiber, that is going to require larger fiber cables in order to have a dedicated solution to all of the end users. With larger fiber cables, you generally have a higher cost and a higher maintenance cost. For the dedicated solution, you would generally see an active Ethernet deployment. And then if we take a look at the picture below for the active optical network, you can see we have the same 4 users with the traffic, but it's a dedicated feed. So it's only that subscribers traffic that is going to the ONT. So we don't have a shared resource here. Taking a look at the distributed split, which we mentioned earlier, you'll have some splitters, those 1x32 splitters located in the field. They're commonly deployed in either cabinets and or splice cases. Like I mentioned, this is going to be a shared bandwidth solution. And then your PON electronics are going to typically be located at the central office or your primary electronics location, which would be a GPON or an XGS PON solution. And you can typically upgrade to new versions of PON electronics, keeping the same split ratios without having to upgrade your outside plant infrastructure, as long as you've designed it in a manner that allows you to do that. But typically you're able to increase from one electronics version to the other, which is very nice for scalability and growth of your network. We do have a sample kind of a distributed split outside plant architecture here in the upper corner. Matt, if you go ahead and advance the slide, it'll increase the image. Thank you. You can see we have the main feed fiber in blue, which then comes to the 1x32 splitter, and then breaks off on a smaller cable count where it's then a dedicated fiber from the splitter to the end user there. So an example of what a distributed split architecture with passive splitters located in the field would look like. For a dedicated home run solution, you have like I said, from your central office or head end location to the subscriber locations, you have a dedicated fiber. So each of these locations has a single piece of glass, dedicated fiber within those cables running along the entire path. With a dedicated home run solution, you can operate either an active Ethernet or a GPON, XGS-PON solution. If you're going to be deploying a PON solution, you would just have your splitters located in the same facility as your electronics are stored. It's a fiber to every customer. It allows for a lot of growth and flexibility, in that you're not limited like you would be in a solution where you have splitters deployed in the field to be able to upgrade from maybe a PON solution to an active Ethernet solution. With the home run dedicated design, you have a lot of flexibility and growth, but it does have higher fiber counts that are required to deploy that. But with the dedicated solution, you do not have any sharing of fiber or bandwidth if active electronics are chosen. So taking a look at the ONT or the optical network terminal, this is the piece of electronics that are actually located at the subscriber's house, and they can either be located outdoors on the side of the house in an enclosure, or indoors. There are a lot of indoor ONT options now where they're actually located in the house. And then this is where your fiber connection would terminate, is at the ONT, and then all of these subscribers broadband devices that they would have in their house would connect into that. So computer, if you're doing a video service, your set-top box for television, a voice service, the telephones would connect into the ONT, along with any other of the broadband internet connecting devices that you may have in your house now as part of a smart home deployment, whether that could be some sensors, some cameras, smart appliances. The average household can have upwards of 20 plus items connected to the internet at any given time. So a lot of items going through and connecting to the ONT. To give a couple of pictures and some examples there, like I said, it's the optical network terminal. The costs do vary on functionality. Some ONTs only will provide an Ethernet kind of internet connection. Others will have connections for a voice service, also having that data Ethernet connection, along with maybe a video service, whether that be an RF based or an IP video service. So ONTs can vary in cost a little bit depending on their functionality and what it is they're providing to the end user and the subscriber, but they're able to provide all three, not only just internet connectivity, but also voice connectivity and also video service, if that's something that you look at deploying. Some of the common fiber to the home electronics vendors that you may see, there's Adtran, Calix, Zone, or DZS is a common provider. Some not listed here. Nokia has a fiber to the home solution as well. So these are going to be some of the common fiber to the home access vendors that you may be working with in your network as you're deploying a fiber-based solution. Like I mentioned, some of the other services, broadband isn't just a connectivity to the internet, as Douglas had mentioned earlier, and especially with a lot of grants and opportunities that are coming out, voice a lot of times is a requirement. Not only do you have to provide an internet connection, but you also have to provide a voice solution. So there's typically two types of voice solutions. You have a TDM, which is going to be more of your standard voice offering with a traditional voice switch. And then you have a VoIP solution, or voice over internet protocol, And that would be a voice solution that's actually operating over your internet traffic and connectivity there. And that's where having low latency and a fair amount of capacity is going to be critical, because if you don't have a low latency solution and you're crunched for the amount of bandwidth that you're able to offer a VoIP solution, it may have, you know, the voice connectivity may be poor, it may lag. But if you in a fiber deployment where you have low latency and you're able to offer very fast speeds, the quality of a connection and a voice conversation over a VoIP connection over a TDM, you would not be able to tell the difference. It's very clear over a VoIP solution. In addition, video. You may or may not be looking at deploying video. You know, that's something that you may have to take a look at from a financial feasibility perspective. You know, maybe it's for your demographics, you know, you're really kind of required just with the you know, the demographics that you're serving to provide a video solution. Maybe you're not. It's a little up in the air in industry right now as to whether those are providing a traditional video service that has like the you know, the traditional TV guide set-top box solution, or what we're seeing a lot right now is a transition to OTT or over-the-top streaming video services. You know, Hulu, Netflix, Disney Plus. There's lots of different options out there, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with a lot of them. That's really a big push, and where we're seeing a lot go in terms of the video services. You know, providers aren't necessarily, you know, offering a traditional video service as, you know, the end users and subscribers are just, you know, purchasing and being members of various over the top video services, in which case your internet and bandwidth connection is crucial, as they're going to be streaming those and using those services over the internet. Managed Wi-Fi, special access dedicated circuits, and then also dark fiber leasing, maybe some other services that you're able to provide as part of your fiber network. So there's lots of different options and lots of things that you can provide with a fiber-based solution on top of just the traditional internet connection that a lot of people think about when they think about a broadband. And then the last thing to really touch on from a technology and a broadband perspective, next slide, Matt, is the regulatory. There is a lot of regulatory and a lot of acronyms, way too many for us to be able to cover all of them on this call. But here are a lot of the ones that you may see as you are looking at broadband and deploying that. And then depending on which services you offer, may depend on which regulatory requirements you have to comply with. As an example, if you're just providing a broadband connection, you may just have a subset of some regulatory requirements. But if you're providing both a broadband and a voice service, there are going to be additional regulatory requirements as part of that voice offering. So wanting to make sure that, as part of what you're deploying and offering, that you're staying on top of a lot of the regulatory terms. And this is where there are a lot of acronyms, and it can be very confusing and sometimes difficult to maneuver. And having conversations with others to make sure that you're on track and you're meeting all of your requirements is very critical. In addition to the technology deployment. So that's really what I had prepared for today's call, just kind of a high level on some of the different technology options that are available for, the deployment of a broadband solution and kind of where the industry is going.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. And again, thank you, Douglas. We really appreciate your contributions here. And for those who may seem intimidated by the jargon or the tech talk, if you're a local community or a stakeholder interested in leveraging historic funding for broadband access or infrastructure expansion, this is perhaps as technical as it's ever going to get. And so I think the point is, here at the Office of Broadband in Illinois and through collaborators, we're here to help. And so we want to inspire a conversation around, community vision, and also point to funding opportunities that are out there and other resources, including our office, that are here to help you navigate these waters. And so before we say anything else, I just wanted to pass the mic back to Nancy. Do we have any questions that we'd like to spend a few moments going through?
Yeah, some questions have started to come through, and similarly, to just add on to what Matt's saying, I know this content is challenging for a newcomer, and we really thank the presenters for covering the nomenclature around networks and technology around broadband. I want to invite participants to ask a question in the chat box, but I also want to invite you to direct message me any question you feel you'd be more comfortable just submitting to me, and then I pass on to the presenter as well, because I know that some of us just have different degrees of timidity with the different meetings. So just to make it clear that that is always an option, to direct message me your questions. So we had a first question come through about looking at a community's infrastructure feasibility. We had a participant that was wondering about a cell phone tower on a college campus and how that would be considered for their community to move forward in looking at their infrastructure. And so I know you had a slide that had a diagram of a broadband network using blue and green and red, Eric, and or it could have been Douglas. You had that diagram up there. I just would ask you to elaborate on the component that would address this question of cell tower usage.
That was Eric's. And yeah, Eric, you want to just describe that the cell tower is going to be in the green space?
Yeah, so the cell tower would definitely be, in the green space in terms of providing the, the broadband, connectivity, in terms of it being the last mile connection between, the provider and the subscriber using that. So, the cell tower would offer, maybe some, availability for, deploying some fixed wireless type, broadband to be able to serve the area. And then with that, you may run fiber to the, the tower is the backfeed, but a tower in terms of a broadband deployment may be able to be used in the last mile. Just to clarify a little, because we were just noting that cell towers, in terms of a last mile broadband solution, would be in the green. The diagram here shows the cell tower in blue. Cell towers can also be used for transport, point to point type connections as well, that would offer a higher speed, such as the 1 gigabit per second that's indicated here in the diagram. But from a broadband connectivity last mile perspective, you would see that in the green part of the network as a point to multi-point solution, where you have some electronics on the tower reaching to multiple end users in the community.
And Nancy, this is Matt. To that question, if the participant was getting at whether or not this is a fundable approach to expanding broadband, I think in many cases it could be. And so there are a lot of different programs, whether they're federal or state. I think we're seeing an increasing emphasis on fully scalable approaches that rely upon fiber, that are built to last. That being said, I think that you can have different sorts of electronics or technology that's used to provide that last mile connection. And certainly, cellular, or as Eric's mentioning here, point to multi-point service is certainly, an example of that. And so again, we're talking a lot of tech today, but in the future webinars we've got coming up, we're intending to deconstruct this a little bit and make the translation on how this tech talk and the focus on broadband internet and infrastructure expansion can be put to use with current dollars and be part of a doable vision for a local community. And so that's the whole key here, is you want to translate what's shared today into an actual plan for our communities.
And Matt, Douglas here. The concept of a cell tower, well, let's go back to the metrics, the broadband service metrics. If broadband is going to be delivered over that cell tower to multi-users, the buzz right now is 5G millimeter wave, which definitely satisfies, if you're close enough to the antenna, it's definitely satisfies the speed, latency, and capacity. It might not satisfy price because it can be a little pricey if you do that. So any service that you're thinking, okay, can this technology deliver broadband? I would encourage you to think about, okay, go back to the metrics, speed, latency, capacity, price, and how does that fit? Because that's where the interface is from the technology to the customer are those metrics.
Thank you so much. That provides a distinction and as well as implications, Douglas. So thank you. I wanted to thank Eric for clarifying the specs behind active and passive optical networks. Do you have any idea of community statistics or some community stats that align better with one versus the other? And what would implicate needing a split option?
Yeah, so when looking at a specific, community and deciding whether or not you'd like to use a kind of a split passive optical network solution or a dedicated, fiber solution, density and distance start to play a lot into that from an overall fiber cable, size perspective and in the design of the network. So looking at density, overall layout of the community and area being served, and then where you're going to be able to have your electronics locations. With a dedicated solution where you may get into larger fiber sizes at the electronics location, it does require a little bit more room for terminating all of those fibers and being able to connect into them for usage. So if you're limited on space or availability on the room to be able to deploy the equipment, sometimes a split architecture is beneficial in that it may require less real estate for electronics and equipment racking versus a dedicated solution. But that really starts to come down to the density and what size fiber cable the different designs may push you into using. So a little bit of an answer in that, no network is cookie cutter and they're all unique and should be approached that way, in the design and when you're processing and kind of doing your long-term planning there. You're going to want to take a look at some of the different design options and what's available to you as part of that, because one solution may fit you better than maybe your neighbor.
Thank you. So we have a question. Have you found the recently publicized supply chain issues impacting the ability to obtain delivery of broadband equipment, supplies, and material used in broadband network construction?
Yeah, so certainly supply chain issues are impacting all industries right now, and that certainly includes the broadband industry as well. There's, all aspects are seeing longer lead times, with, all components and aspects of broadband, whether it be electronics, fiber cable, miscellaneous nuts and bolts, and enclosures. Certainly we're seeing, increases in some of the lead times and availability there, as are all industries with the supply chain issue. The broadband industry is certainly seeing that as well.
We had another question come through. Some communities with fiber have rural stakeholders or some very, very small satellite communities of it could be, just a handful of households that are interested in knowing to what extent the FTTH fiber to the home configurations, to what extent those could assist their connectivity. How would you advise them?
Yeah, so we've seen fiber network deployed in very, very rural environments. A lot of times, when talking in rural environments, we talk locations per mile. We've seen successful fiber deployments deployed not only to, low densities where we're talking a couple locations per mile, but you could almost flip that and talk miles per location. To where there, are still opportunities for a successful deployment in very rural areas. Now there may be some funding, grant funding, et cetera, to assist with those deployments in those very rural areas. But we've seen successful fiber deployments done with densities as low as miles per location, let alone a few locations per mile. So certainly something to take a look at and always review from a financial feasibility perspective, and what may be available to you for various funding options to be able to deploy a network. But we've seen very successful fiber to the home deployments in extremely rural environments.
And I would add, Nancy, that there are some communities that might have pockets of areas where there's no, fiber deployment. These grants are probably really tailored to meet those, to satisfy those pocket problems. So you have fiber, for example, in a neighboring community or a neighborhood, and yet for some reason the adjacent neighbors, or for whatever reason, don't have the deployment that they need, the infrastructure they need to get the services that they're demanding. These grants are really tailored for that type of an application. You would go in, you could do various different options, and we'll talk about those in other seminars. But for example, a public-private partnership. The community says, hey, we've got a problem in this particular quadrant of this particular area, and let's partner with a known provider and get the funds so that fiber can be deployed.
That's great. So you both would advise this approach to neighboring small towns of 100 or so?
It's across the board. Really, it's very case by case specific. But yes, you could have, if you have, for example, you have a rural telephone company that usually they do a very good job in providing services, and you have a neighboring town or a neighboring community that doesn't have a community-based provider. They're getting basic telephone service and communication services from a larger provider, and that larger provider might not be too interested in that neighboring community. Well, you've got an opportunity to say, okay, well, let's try and address this problem in that larger provider's area. You could partner with a smaller community-based provider that's adjacent, or there are other providers as well. There's municipalities that also do broadband on their own, and there's also electric municipal cooperatives that are available and in play to provide broadband to that needed community. So again, there are options. There are a lot of options for community leaders to try to address first of all, assess where the problems are, and then address how to best match the resources that are nearby to meet the need.
Thank you. It's great. I don't currently see any other questions here. We are past the hour. I would just ask Douglas, Eric, and Matt if you have sort of any other overarching ideas or takeaways for everybody, maybe on the types of technology you envision for good coverage, community to community, or even any other thing you might be thinking in the back of your mind. Maybe you could think of a question that folks maybe haven't thought of, and provide some lasting takeaways to our group, please.
Sure. Let me go first, and then Eric will clean everything up. Obviously, with the grant monies that are available that Matt described, and that we'll be getting into details later in another weeks, your first choice should at least be looking at fiber. Fiber has a longevity and a capacity that is very attractive going forward, given the uncertainty as to, like I described, what is going to be needed in 2030, even and what speeds and capacities and characteristics and network characteristics are going to be needed. Fiber should at least be something you look at, and most people would probably say that's your preference, that fiber should be the preference if you can do it. But then if you can't, then there are other technologies that can deliver the broadband short and near term, possibly not long term, but short and near term. What you don't want to do is get into a situation where you build a technology, or you rely on a technology that is going to have to be replaced in a few years. You want to have a longer horizon for the technology, and that's why fiber is so attractive in that it provides really good long-term solution. As far as the concept, and one of the takeaways on this particular session is that, yeah, broadband has a lot of technical stuff to it and whatnot, but really boiled down to it, it's a service that is used as a tool by your residents and businesses to be successful, either in education or in business, or in social arenas, that type of thing. There's all kinds of uses for this tool, and the concept and really the initiative that the United States has right now is to make sure that we can solve the broadband gap, the digital divide, and have availability of reliable and robust broadband to everyone. And so don't be intimidated by the technology, because that's overcome. People, there are resources in the world and in the nation and in your community to address those obstacles, and then they don't become obstacles as far as getting a handle on this thing. What you're doing is you're thinking about, how do I get a service to a customer, and what's the best vehicle for that delivery?
So
go ahead.
As part of that, looking at fiber, and then looking at some of the other broadband technologies, as you're looking at deploying into some of the unserved and underserved areas within your community, always kind of looking at the strategic planning, and maybe some long-term goals for where you'd like to take your community, versus a little bit of a piece part solution. Always having that big picture plan and goal for where you'd like to go, the areas you'd like to serve, and the kind of offerings that you'd like to be able to provide to those members within your communities is always helpful and will be extremely beneficial in the long run. Taking a look at fiber, and then looking at some of the other options, such as fixed wireless, maybe on some existing towers that you have available as options as well. But always having some of those upfront planning discussions to start to put a plan and picture in place for where you'd like to go, and how you'd like to see the network deployed and your community served here over the next several years, as you look at overtaking some of these build outs.
Well, thanks again, Nancy, for helping us with the logistics today and for being a great moderator, and also Douglas and Eric, we really appreciate your insight. And again, for those joining us, this is as technical as it's going to get. And so we wanted to start with this tech talk in describing Broadband 101 and use it as a spring forward for making sense of this and applying it to your community and your vision in how you can take advantage of this historic opportunity to truly solve the broadband conundrum that may be facing your community, position your community to succeed in the decades ahead. And those are the what's on the line here. And so we really look forward to re-engaging here. You can see in front of you our next webinar is scheduled for next Friday, November 12th, with 2 that follow. These are all recorded, will be posted on YouTube, and we'll also point to a number of the resources referenced in here in the comments on the YouTube site, and certainly on our Connect Illinois website as well. Wanted to mention 2 things. One, there's great, I think, 6-part webinar series that took place this past summer in collaboration with Benton Institute, our Broadband Leadership Series, and that's available on Illinois Extension website, as well as our Connect Illinois website. And then we do have a 3-part series starting next November 16th with Benton Institute and Bill Coleman focusing on broadband. And so check that out. If you have any questions, never hesitate to reach out to us at broadband@illinois.gov. And I guess I would just close with this point. You know, one of the roles that we have at the Office of Broadband is to be a connector, both literally in extending networks, but also figuratively in making introductions among the many stakeholders in Illinois that want to see better broadband at the community level. And so with that said, you've met a couple of stakeholders here that have been active in our Connect Illinois program. If there's anybody listening out there that would like to collaborate or connect in meaningful ways, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We look forward to making those connections and together advancing the cause of better broadband. And so that's all for me today. Thanks for those who stuck around. Nancy, any closing comments on your end?
Nope, just a big thank you to presenters and participants, and I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you all.